Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to discuss this because most of this conversation is never ending, and for me, most of it takes place on Facebook and Twitter with people on the other side of the Atlantic. And it tends to be extremely emotional because it's an extremely emotional time, I think, in the evolution of American society. People are not quite sure how much longer the almost intolerable logjam will continue in American politics. And I'm hoping that tonight we can talk face to face about some of these questions. And the panel here is the right one, I think, to lead this discussion. But we're going to be bringing you in sooner rather than later, I hope, because we should all be talking about what's going on over there. So let me introduce the panel first. Rob Carolina is the chairman of Democrats Abroad UK, and for his day job, an intellectual property lawyer. And intellectual properties, you can either decide whether Congress has any or not by the end of this discussion. He's from Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. Felicity Spector is from Channel 4 News. She's covered every election in America since 2000, and writes about America, covered this election, and I assume you're from London, Felicity.
I'm actually from Birmingham.
From Birmingham.
You admit it in public.
Oh, you mentioned Stoke Newington on the way in, and I thought, oh, God, she's from my neighborhood. Birmingham counts anyway, and what's interesting about this panel is that the Americans were not in America for the election, but Felicity was. And I think it's important to get that British perspective. And last on the panel is Nick Schifrin, who's the ABC News correspondent, and his contact with America over the last 4 years has been somewhat minimal because he's been in Kabul for ABC, and he's only just been reassigned here to London for the last 8 months. So that's our panel. And to begin with, one of the problems with talking about American politics, American general, is with the news cycle so amped up at the moment, you can hardly breathe or look over the parapet and see what the future is. I mean, even today, as I was driving in, and probably some of you were able to catch the news, the president was putting forward his proposals for gun control. That will dominate discussion now up until probably his inauguration on January 20th. But I wonder how much we'll be talking about it in 2 years' time. So the first thing I'm going to ask the panel to do, we'll just work our way around, is to think for a minute and then identify the one issue that they think will dominate the coming 4 years for President Obama as he faces this second term. And I'll start with Rob, yeah?
The one issue that's tough, if I had to, I think the one issue as I see it is, generally speaking, federal spending. And that then includes things like debt ceiling, like the just avoided fiscal cliff that didn't exist anyway, so it was easy to avoid. But yeah, federal spending is going to be the big political football for the next 4 years.
Felicity?
I think similarly it will be something to do with the economy, whether it's something as enormous as the fate of the middle class, which has been squeezed for years and which is going to be further affected if there are massive spending cuts, tax hikes, whatever happens. I think there's going to be such a big battle over economic issues with the two parties really intractable over it that unfortunately is going to dominate everything.
Nick?
And I'm going to go a little bigger here and combine two things, Obama doctrine and legacy. And I think with Obama doctrine, I think look at the two people that he's now hired for his national security team, Chuck Hagel, a Republican who opposed the Iraq War, and so another sign that Obama's trying to distance himself from Bush. And at the same time, John Brennan is the head of the CIA. Here's a guy who defended torture, the architect of the drone campaign, like a supersized version of Bush in 2008. And so if the Obama doctrine is fewer boots on the ground, Hagel, more drones from the sky, Brennan, is he going to apply that to all of the foreign policy challenges we see now? And legacy, is he actually going to focus in on the states? Is his legacy going to be gun control? getting kids in the inner city to college, to university. I mean, if you take the amount of money that he spent in Afghanistan, I think you could send every kid in the U.S. to school, to university twice. And so will he finally focus on some of the things that a lot of the people who voted for him, frankly, want him to?
Or you could say that his legacy has already been creating a new healthcare system, and making that work will be perhaps the biggest challenge of the second term.
Yeah, although
which is because it means the most to people.
Yeah, although we won't even see that until 2015 or beyond, and beyond his control now. So,
Okay, let's stop there. That's a very interesting idea, Nick, and I'm going to keep that in mind, but let's refocus on the domestic first in this conversation, and go to the economy and ask, is there anything in depth that a political process that's so stuck can do in terms of creating the right economic conditions to get growth? And maybe we should just start by saying, what is a sign of growth? Is it 3% GDP this year, which is predicted, or is growth something more in terms of job creation? Rob?
Well, I think that the answer is, in a sense, suggested by your question, which is, if in fact we continue to have such a huge and untenable amount of political logjam on Capitol Hill, then of necessity it's going to be difficult to do the kinds of things that are going to spur economic growth. And to some extent, the lack of economic growth can be attributed to that untenable, unreasonable level of political logjam. The one has significantly fed into the other. So if the question is, if everything stays as jammed as it is now, what's that going to do for the economy? The answer is nothing good. We'll be treading water and growing very slowly. My number one hope is that something will happen to break up that logjam a little bit. I mean, we've had one thing already, which is decisively winning this last election and increasing numbers on Capitol Hill.
Felicity?
Well, we were talking about appointments earlier, and Jack Lew, who's the new Treasury Secretary, is by all accounts, a very consummate political operator, but also a progressive who does believe in spending, public spending, infrastructure spending. And what the whole message behind the press conference that Obama gave, the last one of his first term, was that we have to have a balanced approach where you can't just achieve anything by spending cuts. You have to have tax increases. You have to have, as he put it, everyone paying their fair share, closing tax loopholes and so on. But he has already spent billions on infrastructure spending, and that's the approach I guess that the new administration will take in terms of building growth through jobs creation. The whole point behind the pivot to jobs that happened during the last election cycle was that I think that Obama realised that simply talking about the deficit doesn't mean much to people who know somebody in their immediate family probably, or in their neighbourhood, who's lost their job or is losing their job or has lost their house or has gone into restricted hours. That's what hurts people, and that's what needs to change, I guess, for people to feel that the economy is getting better.
But one of the things that's interested me about this is that there's a lot of talk about infrastructure, spending, but are the people who've been thrown out of work people who would know how to build infrastructure? And I ask this, Felicity, of you. I mean, it's not a challenge. I'm just curious. There was a very interesting article last week, an economics blog in the New York Times, that pointed out that more than 650,000 jobs had been lost in the public sector. And I think the exact number was 690 something, and 720,000 had been created in the private sector in the previous 4 years, for a net gain over the last 4 years of 48,000 jobs, a fraction of a percent. And you think, well, everybody talks about infrastructure. Washington talks about infrastructure. It becomes a meme. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with reality. And if all those clerical folk and teachers who have been fired in California and in all the states that are up against it financially, I mean, could they rivet? Could they throw a rivet on a bridge that's about to fall into the Mississippi River?
But this is the problem, isn't it, for the federal government? It has a limited range of things which it can spend money on, given that a lot of spending is controlled by states, and a lot of the public sector jobs that have been lost have been from Republican-controlled states which believe in outsourcing and cutting back, putting jobs out to tender to the private sector. So it's about the only thing he has the capacity to spend money on. The economic idea behind it, I guess, is that there will be people to fill those jobs, and that will generate more money into the economy, and that trickles down. I mean, it's a classic Keynesian argument.
I think to pick up on that a little bit, though, I would suggest that we shouldn't have such a restrictive view of what we mean by infrastructure in this context. To me, infrastructure means not just roads and bridges, which we certainly need. We certainly need road repairs. We certainly need bridge repairs. We can't suffer or the embarrassment of another interstate bridge collapse, which I never thought I would see in my lifetime. But infrastructure also, I think, means creating the type of environment that allows the country to succeed, which would include education infrastructure, bringing and financing teachers, both at secondary level as well as higher education, financing research and development, and bringing research and development and operational manufacturing more into the mix of industry that's happening in the U.S. So I mean, if we take that kind of broader view, you're never going to find a one-for-one replacement of someone loses a job here and all of their skills are immediately portable there. But I think if we broaden our perspective out on what infrastructure is, because all of the things that I'm saying help add to the economy and help create the conditions for success, then I think it's that much more likely that people will be able to find something else.
Nick, you're from LA. I wonder, how often when you went back, did you get back from Kabul?
About once a year.
About once a year. And when you came back to the U.S., what was your feeling about infrastructure, economy, just where the society was going?
Well, California was bankrupt. I mean, literally bankrupt at the time when I would go back. But just to make it a little more broad, I think, and 2 points. One, Romney ran. 90% of his time was spent on I'm a better economic head honcho, if you will, for the country, and it was rejected. 2, Europe has tried the path of austerity. The U.S. is creating some jobs, to your point. So I think that, yes, there's a lot of Americans who are upset, a lot of Americans who are out of work, a lot of Americans, especially in California, who have been lost their jobs, or the unions have been attacked. Lots of things have happened. But when it comes down to it, actually, the U.S. isn't doing so bad. And so it's up to the politicians to, frankly, move on. I mean, we were talking about this before. They were trying to pass Hurricane Sandy relief. I mean, this is just a few $1 billion or $50 billion, I forget what the number was, to help people, victims of Hurricane Sandy. And they couldn't even pass that. And I think Congress is less popular than cockroaches in the States right now. So if looking at the broad picture, the U.S. is doing a little better, and that Congress needs to realize that and compare it. In comparison to Europe, I mean, the U.S. is doing better. It needs to push forward and move beyond the logjam.
Apparently, Congress is more popular than the Ebola virus, though, so it's not.
But if we're talking about challenges for the president, when you've got a Congress that is that unpopular, where's the challenge? I mean, surely he should be able to move some things pretty smoothly, yeah?
But that's just not how the system works anymore.
No, I know how the system. I understand that, but I mean, is there something that he's not doing?
But if in his last press conference, he obviously, and it was, as you said, picked up by the New York Times, that he complained that no one from the Republican Party wanted to socialise with him anymore, and that he'd been. Boehner had turned down 6 dinner invitations and so on. He was sitting there lonely in the White House, no one to play cards with, but. You can imagine why that is. I mean, the guy has tried reaching out to the opposite side of the aisle on numerous occasions, and it's got absolutely nowhere. And there's been all this gridlock, and now they have to invent these crises, these sort of, oh my God, everything's going to end in 3 months' time if we don't pass this legislation. It still doesn't happen. They kick it forward 3 months, but it's a crazy way to run a country, if you like, to kind of create these crises which you have to sort of lurch between, and they're all very market sensitive.
But here's a man who claimed that. Sorry, here's a man who claimed quickly that he would break that. He would break
absolutely.
the Washington politics as usual. That's how he ran. That's what he promised. He has failed to do that. I think most people would argue that. And perhaps gun control today, whatever it was, 24 executive orders. Maybe we'll see, and we could talk about this with foreign policy too. Maybe we'll see a more aggressive Barack Obama taking his popularity, whatever it may be, for a spin.
Well, that's
Rob,
the point.
is the challenge for him to be more aggressive?
Well, I think we're already starting to see a change in the way that he's communicating with Congress as a body. I mean, we've seen that in the fiscal cliff negotiations, and we're beginning to see that with the upcoming debt ceiling issue. I'm not even going to call that a negotiation because the president has made clear that he's not calling it a negotiation. And I think so we are seeing a bit of a shift in his style for dealing with that because he entered office, and many of us who've been campaigning for him since the day he announced were very excited about that kind of approach. Let's reach across the aisle, let's create a cooperative environment. And unfortunately, what we all learned is that you can't create a cooperative environment when only one party is willing to cooperate. And so we're certainly seeing a difference in approach, and I think that produced some positive benefits in the fiscal cliff thing. And I think we'll see, we may well see a different type of resolution or a different style of resolution to the debt ceiling.
There's some people who would say, in his own party, that when you say my bottom line is 250,000 for the tax rate, and before you even negotiate, you're up to 450. That perhaps whatever he says rhetorically isn't necessarily how he acts when he gets into the room with the guys.
Well, that was, in the defense of the president, that was a pretty easy jump to make, because when that figure of 250 was first established, there was a lot of shifting around for a while. Is it going to be 500? Is it going to be 100? Is it going to be 250? Ultimately, the figure of 250 was settled on. I mean, if you look at the U.S. tax code, there would be some perverse consequences of fixing the number at 250 rather than 450 because or 400 because of the way the tiered system runs. It would have worked an unfairness to people in that weird little bracket. But more importantly, yeah, he shifted to 400, fine, shifted to 450 for couples. But having made that shift, the Republicans misread the situation and said, oh, if he'll go that far, he'll go further. He'll go much further. And he said, no, I won't. No, he'll definitely go further. No, we won't. Okay, we got to wait for him to counteroffer. Silence.
Felicity, when you've been covering the last two elections, off the record, you don't have to name anybody, did you hear complaints about the president's negotiating skills?
It's interesting to see. A lot of people feel very disappointed that the things they thought Obama would be good at, things like negotiating, things like communicating his message, he's turned out to be what a lot of people consider very disappointing. I mean, he was meant to, he had these incredible rhetorical skills. I mean, I remember going to some Obama rallies in '08, and it was just amazing, the spirit in the crowd and so on. And then the message sort of just failed to come out from the White House about what he was doing, and he lost substantial ground on healthcare because they were just sort of taking the summer off when the Tea Party were making all the running, and that's just perplexed a lot of people. I suppose they expected that he would be someone as a lawyer and so on, and as a grassroots operator who would be very good at that, and can't quite understand why he's become this kind of aloof figure.
There was someone who once said, and I forget where it was, maybe it was in the New Yorker, maybe it was Robert Gibbs, his former spokesman, giving an interview. He actually said that Barack Obama doesn't like very many people. He doesn't like very many people. He likes his wife, likes his kids, likes a few people around him. Doesn't really show a lot of respect to other people. And I think the critics who you are referring to would definitely say that. Just one more point to go back to Republicans, though, the notion of, okay, well, you need another party to negotiate with. There's a problem within the Republican Party itself. I mean, John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, essentially the third most important politician in the states when it comes to presidential succession, tried to pass a bill, tried to do an end around during the fiscal cliff, tried to pass a bill, couldn't even get his own party to vote for it. So I think there's real problems within that party as well that we're talking about.
One last question for the panel, then we'll open up to the floor on the economy. We often get stuck with this short view. This isn't new, though. This has been going on at least since Bill Clinton lost that midterm in '94 and was suddenly confronted with intransigence in a Republican-dominated House. Why has there been no strategy to deal with this? It has been almost 18 years to figure out a way to either go over the heads of the House to the public or develop whatever arm twisting is necessary by veterans to get around this problem. But why have Democrats failed to invent this?
Well, necessity is the mother of invention, and I would suggest that one of the great benefits that Bill Clinton had during his administration was a lack of necessity, in part because the economy was growing very fast. all boats were rising. Everyone felt good about their place in the world. The middle class didn't feel at threat. And at that point, it's like, well, why should we, the American people, care so very much about what's going on in Washington? The rancor between the parties was bad and getting worse, but it didn't really necessarily mean much in the life of everyday Americans every place in the U.S. Our president now inherited the biggest financial disaster since the Great Depression. And suddenly, everything matters that much more. And the Republican strategy, the rancor, got that much worse. So that is, we're all sort of learning as we go here. And any negotiator, whether it's political or business or anything else, eventually has to learn to adapt their style depending on who and what they're negotiating with. And I think that's what we're seeing now with the president.
Felicity?
And obviously Obama has a key advantage that he doesn't need to seek re-election. So he can be, if he wants to be, if he has the stomach to do it, it could be a lot stronger and a lot more, uses presidential powers a lot more extensively, because it doesn't, he doesn't need to start campaigning in 2 years' time.
And I would argue that it's not necessarily just the Democrats who have failed to develop a scheme or develop a way to do this. I mean, both parties, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think both parties have some blame in terms of redistricting. I mean, America is red and blue in part because the lawmakers in the House have decided that to make their little districts more palatable or to make their reelection more likely, they would redesign districts. And therefore you get both sides going apart from each other. You get fewer moderates, and you get districts that are conservative and liberal. And that's creating a big gulf in the middle.
Okay, let's throw this out and to the audience, and let me ask you your thoughts and any questions for the panel about the challenge of the economy, the challenge that President Obama faces in getting an economy that's expanding but not creating enough jobs, in particular. Sir.
I just have two questions. One is, how do you get rid of pork? How do you get rid of pork?
How do you get rid of
without
pork?
being a Muslim? And the other one is, how do you get back to the time when people could move around to take jobs when they're available?
That's an interesting question. We can either take them together or take them separately. Maybe separately. Pork. The question of pork. Nick.
I'm not sure you can get rid of pork. And for those of you who are wondering what this is, pork is how the system works. Pork is what you put on a Hurricane Sandy relief bill, and you throw $1 million to a salmon fishing farm in Alaska or whatever it is, because that's just the deals that are made.
Bribery in the rest of the world.
Well, is it called bribery? I'm surely in the House of Commons, there's a bit of back scratching that goes on. Just a bit.
Not quite as blatant as
Not
that.
quite as much. Regardless of whether you call it bribery or not, a lot of people have tried to get rid of it. And short of naming and shaming some people, so the senator from Alaska, what was his name? I forget. The bridge to nowhere. You shame him publicly, and that's when people might vote against you. But short of that, I mean, there's so much pork, even by people who pretend or claim not to be pork peddlers, for lack of a better word. So I don't know. I don't see any way to get rid of pork. I think that's just how they like it, and they'll keep it that way, referring to the House and the Senate, the senators themselves.
There are two things on that. The one is a congressman run every 2 years. There's a great book that I remember reading, Why American Politicians Govern Too Little and Run Too Much. And it basically, you have to spend half of your term raising money to campaign to stay in office for the next term. So you're so heavily reliant on the big donors and so heavily in hock to anybody who can help fundraise for you that you can't really afford to ignore their special interests.
Well, surely that could be changed.
But-
It wouldn't require a genius to change it.
Well, if you look at, unfortunately, Citizens United ruling has meant that the big money is just completely dominating election campaigns.
But
Well, actually, I think we need to draw a distinction because we're now talking about two different issues. One issue is the challenge of pork barrel politics. And pork barrel politics is a phrase that entered the American lexicon, I think, in the mid-19th century. So this concept has been around for a long time. The second issue, though, that's just come on the table from up here, though, is the connection of sort of special interest financing of elections with other things that then follow on. I think we have to address the two separately. One of the challenges with pork barrel politics is that another way to call it is, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. There are deals done amongst and between members of Congress in order to get legislation to pass. There we're talking about negotiations that happen on Capitol Hill amongst and between members of the body. And I tend to agree that you'll never get rid of all of the nutty deals that are done. All you can try to do is shine a light on the most egregious of them. For some people, though, what one person, there's this old saying, one person's pork is another person's fundamental necessary public works process. Each of these members of Congress is responsible to their own constituency. They're responsible. They don't have to answer to the national party. They don't have to answer to the state party. They have to answer to their local constituents, and they have to demonstrate to them every 24 months that they've done something that's worth being reelected.
What's interesting is how many of the southern states, which are resolutely red, and I think it's part of the schizophrenia of American politics, that all over the planet, red means left, except in America, where red means rabidly right. One of the things that's so interesting is how addicted to pork they really are. The hypocrisy that goes with it is astonishing. Just as an aside, I went to Mississippi in 1995 to do some reporting for the World Service, and I thought, well, it'll be a dump, and it wasn't, because the two Republican senators from Mississippi at the time were Haley Barbour and oh gosh, he's got an airport named after him down in Biloxi, and I forget his name because he brought the money to build the airport. And the roads were fantastic. The highways were the best in America. I mean, the per capita income is 49th out of 50 states. I mean, it's just they're dirt poor, but their roads were terrific because they just brought the pork home. But what's interesting, and I'll come to you in a second, is that pork is actually, I think, perhaps is becoming less and less of a problem, because used to be you'd add up a bill with a whole bunch of pork, and to get the bill passed, an important bill, the pork would go through these little projects for home districts. But now it's the wedge issues that get tacked on and are stopping things getting through. You get some
Attempt to use abortion.
Abortion stuff, and that is a different and I think a much more dangerous phenomenon, isn't it? You had the question also, and it's an important one, about moving around. Once upon a time, this was a country of great mobility. If the factory shut down in one town, it was hard, it was tough. You packed your belongings, you went to where the work was. This is less and less of a phenomenon, I think, in this downturn. In fact, I think it is one of the remarked-on facts of this downturn, that where once people could pack up, now they have, because it's bad everywhere.
Well, and I think they've also found that employers will get a lot of resumes for a given job and hire no one. And it's becoming a real problem because they are increasing their bar and trying to find someone not only perfect, but who's done that job already. And the fact is they're not finding it, so they're not even filling the jobs. And so that's also exacerbating this problem of people in their 20s and 30s not being able to go to find work and know that they can find it somewhere.
Felicity, have you remarked on the change in mobility?
No, I didn't realise that was the situation. I assume that in today's world, people are more mobile, if you like, because a lot of people don't own property, they rent, and it's easier to give up a rental deal and move somewhere else. And hopefully, maybe even the healthcare changes might help if it allows people to move without sacrificing existing healthcare arrangements, which might not have covered them. I mean, that's happened to a few people I know, that they were in trouble about moving jobs because their kids had existing conditions and they couldn't move because the new employer didn't have the same provision. But maybe that might be something which would help.
In terms of the mobility question, I guess I have a slightly different. I graduated from high school in the early 1980s. I've recently caught up with some of my high school friends through that good old cheerful Facebook thing. And it's shocking to me to find out how many people I went to school with now live more than 500 miles. A huge amount of mobility in the U.S. workforce, but the time scale of the mobility is different, which is to say people are moving 1,000 miles away from home in the hopes that they will have a better life in 5 years' time. And secondly, the effect and impact of the move is much more questionable and much higher risk. And we also see the birth of sort of like long-distance commuting jobs for particularly for white-collar positions. Some of my friends, they talk about their spouse having to get on a plane to commute and live in California for 2 months, and then they'll come back for the weekend and see their family. It's beginning, the migration patterns are beginning to look a bit more like 1920s immigration from Italy than sort of 1950s, I'll go to the next town and get a job in the next factory.
It's interesting. Now, you had a question or a comment.
I have a comment regarding pork.
Here comes the microphone.
So I just wanted to give a little bit of a historical perspective on pork barrel politics. We mentioned that the term comes from the mid-19th century. Well, if you look at American politics, the first pork deal was the exchange of Hamilton's desire for the First National Bank with Madison's desire and Washington's desire to have the national capital close to their homes in Virginia. So that's the very first pork deal, but we actually inherited it from England. If you spend time in the statutes, the early statutes from the 1600s and even earlier, there is pork project after pork project, and you literally can't find the important bills because they're buried in bridges to nowhere.
Okay. Let's move. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Just one very interesting question, which I think is part of the debate of what we've just been discussing, and that's simply when we talk about mobility, increasingly we all know that more people, even if they have to move to Dayton, Ohio, or Cincinnati, or wherever, into the wilds of the worst war zones, we can control everything in terms of how we communicate via the internet. And increasingly more and more people are working from home. Even if they have to only travel 2 days a week or once a week to interface, they're traveling from home. So mobility is also accelerated and is actually fueled by the technology that we have available today. And in terms of job creation, we should never think in terms of having boundaries and road stops that will not allow us to integrate. And I think the internet, we've read the papers today. We see that HMV has closed down 3,000 shops. We've seen Jessop's, a major retailer on the high street here in London, closing down all their camera shops. I think was whatever the amount is because of, they said, mobile phones. But it's the mobility of us being able to access whatever we need, couch sitting on internet. And it's the same thing for job creation, I think.
It's an interesting idea, but I'm still waiting for the promise of job creation out of the internet. As a practicing journalist who earns considerably less today than he did before the penetration of the whole world by the internet, I'm still waiting for that kind of thing. But it is a challenge. I mean, I do think when we talk about the economy, this question was about pork, and it took us down a certain path. It seems to me that the real challenge, if there's a bully pulpit attached to the presidency, the real challenge is to articulate, and if it's not, he may not even be able to articulate it yet, to find in these 4 years, where he doesn't have to run for re-election, a policy that allows for growth. Because clearly, government is going to be a source. The private sector cannot make up the difference. And creating jobs, not directly, but in some way, has to be one of the most enormous challenges he faces in these coming 4 years.
And this is also about legacy. I mean, it is a bully pulpit to a certain extent. The president cannot create jobs by himself. He can start reprioritizing. He can start spending more money at home. I mean, $120 billion in Afghanistan last year. You take that and you put even half of it in the States, create a lot of jobs. So this is about his legacy. This is about his priorities, whether he decides, whether his administration decides, whether he can help push through these notions of we need to put our own house in order before we go out and try and put anyone else's house in order. And to a certain extent, he's said that, he's claimed to do that, but he really hasn't done it. And it's up to him now to do it.
I think the only thing, I mean, looking at his press conference this evening that he was giving about the gun control laws, is that that seems to suggest that he's willing to use that bully pulpit a lot more forcefully than he has done in the first 4 years. He was basically laying down the line and saying, I don't care, this is not negotiable. If I can't work with Congress, I'll work around them.
Okay, yes. No, wait. Yes, we've got the microphone.
You know, last week on Meet the Press, Colin Powell was given half an hour to explain why he thinks that President Obama has not been welcomed by his opposition to bring about what are obviously important decisions to be made and passed in Congress. And one of his premises was that because, not his words but mine, and forgive me, my dear friends here, that he is a Kenyan Irish American. And the fact that there are even birthers who doubt that he was born in the United States, and Republican Party being the party of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, is the reason why he is being bucked by the Republican Congress. Your thoughts?
Can I just make one
Yes.
point on that? I mean, it's very easy to say that the Republicans are one thing and the Democrats are one thing. Let me just put out one fact, and I'll let the other guys jump in. 56% of America, right? There's lots of stats about gun control today. High-capacity clips, semi-automatic weapons, things that in this country and most of the world think are obvious. 56% of Americans want an armed guard outside every school, right? It's not so easy that the red is these, the right are some, rabid white Anglo-Saxon people there, and the left are trying to make a difference. America, I mean, he doesn't have a majority in a lot of these things that we think are obvious. And so, while I think that he should be more aggressive and use bully pulpit, he is trying to navigate these waters. And it is not clear that all of America thinks that some of these things are so obvious that they should be enacted.
Felicity?
I mean, yes, that's been the lesson of the last few elections, is that America is a very divided country. It has been for decades. It still will be, and you can't govern as if that isn't the case. And I think when you look at how the Republican Party is going to need to change, I think that might be the way ahead. I mean, they did so badly in the election because they were the party of the white older voter and the demographic which is shrinking. They're not, they can't sustain themselves politically like this.
Still got 46% though.
They did, but that is the group of the population which is shrinking much more quickly than the rapid growth of the Latino population,
as Nick points
of
out,
the black population.
so long as you've got gerrymandered districts, and not something that the Republicans did. I mean, this goes back to the early 70s in an attempt to increase African American representation in the House of Representatives. There was a certain amount of redistricting that happened, and it created safe seats that were likely to return African Americans to Congress, and it did increase African American representation. And here we are 40 years on from that, and you've got this gerrymandered situation where, you don't pay the price. I mean, it's not a free market in ideas, because the market, it seems to me, is rigged. And if you can get reelected, saying that, the earth is 6,000 years old, and that, Obama is a Kenyan Irish communist and so on, there's no downside for you in changing your thinking.
In fact, if you change your thinking, you won't get reelected.
You'll get your salary and whatever extra emoluments the Koch brothers tend to throw your way.
And a lot of pork.
And a lot of pork.
I think let's look at this slightly differently. I mean, let's acknowledge a couple of realities, just to pick up on some of this. Reality number one, there are people who voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and who voted for him again in 2012 who passionately believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. That's a fact. There are people who are respected intellectuals and who would be respected members of the scientific community who voted for the Republican candidate in 2008 and voted for Romney in 2012. There are people in the Republican Party who are undoubtedly racists and bigots, but they are certainly not, I believe, the majority of that party. They are a significant and vocal minority. And the Democratic Party has its own difficult history to grapple with on issues of, how people feel about race issues within our own party. I don't believe that we should get lulled into a sense of believing that the problems we face now politically are primarily the cause of racial hatred or division or racial differences. Yes, there are some voters, there are some corners of the Republican Party who probably feel emboldened, impassioned, more angry because of the race issue, but I don't think that's the key driver. We need to look at the other issues that are driving the divisions.
Okay. There's a gentleman over here, Millicent.
Thanks. Rather than race, I wonder what the panel think to the idea that actually the thing that perhaps played most against Obama in his first term was that he was so popular when he was elected, and that actually the Republicans were terrified of that and felt that the only political way to combat that was to say no to everything. If they allowed him to appear as a collaborative, effective politician, there was no way that both he and the Democratic Party wouldn't just sweep the boards in both the midterms and the next election. And that actually, if he'd been slightly less popular, there might have been more room for him to have been the collaborative statesman that everyone hoped that he would be.
I mean, there were some claims that the Republicans in Congress refused to pass the jobs bill, for example, because that would have created a better economic climate for Obama to run for election in. I mean, he is, at the moment, his most popular for 3 years or something. He's running at 52%, the poll this morning was suggesting. So, I mean, you get this window of opportunity when you're first elected anyway, when everyone thinks you're great, and then they sort of get tired of you, get bored of you, start finding faults with you.
But even compared to a normal president-elect, he was in the 90s prior to his first inauguration.
I'm not sure it was I'm not sure it was that high, but there was this. You're right. There was a remarkable thing. He got 53.7% of the vote, and then suddenly, I had the sense that Americans said, "Oh my God, we've done this. We actually elected the black guy, and aren't we great?" And he seems like a really good guy, but that was, and he gave a nice speech, and then you had to go down to get to work, and
So
I mean, I remember
and he thought. Correct me if I'm wrong, Felicity. He thought, geez, they like me so much, I'm going to put this health care bill right out there right now.
But he kind of did. But I mean, I remember being at the inauguration in 2008, in 09 rather, and that was, I mean, obviously it was an incredibly different atmosphere 4 years ago than it is in Washington this week. I mean, then there was like 2 million people who flocked there, and it was absolutely amazing. There were people hugging each other in the streets. There were just a lot of African Americans actually, which was great because that's a city which is predominantly African American, but you never see anybody black because they live in the poor area where the white people don't work and so on. But it was like people had reclaimed the city, and it was really exciting, and everyone was just willing this. And when George Bush left in his helicopter, there was this huge booing that went on. And now, apparently, there's lots of spare hotel rooms in Washington this week, and it's not the same atmosphere at all. I mean, it probably wouldn't be anyway, given that second terms are very different. But all that sort of that excitement that was generated, I think, it was very quickly people started saying how disappointed they were. And the problem, as I was saying, with Obama amplifying his message was that because he didn't really, for some reason, take up the baton and really run with the arguments about healthcare, is that the Tea Party suddenly came up into the vacuum during that long summer when he wasn't saying a word. And they all started holding their huge rallies and the talk of these death panels and Sarah Palin, with all her sort of threats and so on about what was going to happen if the healthcare law was passed. And unfortunately, that was what the trajectory of his popularity went down from there.
In part, I mean, there are real ideological differences here. I mean, when we talk about the fiscal cliff, Boehner and Obama truly are ideologically different when it comes to how to stimulate the economy. And so, yeah, maybe there's a lot of politics, but at the end of the day, they are actually different. And, as we were saying before, the flip side of that argument is, okay, Obama's really popular. Well, what can you do with that popularity? What was Bush's line after his re-election? I've got some political capital, and I'm going to spend it. I mean, Obama had political capital, and people did realize in the States, wow, this is amazing.
And how did Bush spend it? He tried to revamp Social Security, and he squandered all his political capital, and everybody said, "Oh, did we vote for this guy again?" And we're losing in Iraq, and it was all downhill from there.
Yeah, and the lesson of Clinton is the same thing. You try and ram through healthcare, and the first thing was gays in the military, and immediately the popularity goes down. So Obama was hesitant, perhaps for a reason, but I think a lot of the critics can say he was too hesitant.
I know these two guys have questions, but I just wanted, because you brought up Bill Clinton. I'm wondering if we can talk a bit about a parallelism here, because Clinton also, I remember in '92, I was over there briefly to cover again for the World Service, and I came back and did some analysis of the actual inauguration day, which was exciting. And again, it was a generational passing of the baton, and the atmosphere in Washington was actually very good in '92. And I'm just wondering if there's something to learn from the way Bill Clinton worked at his second inaugural and the period of time that he had before he got caught up with Monica in terms of building towards legacy and trying to actually use this 24-month golden time when you don't have to, you're not a lame duck yet, you can maybe do something. I wonder if there's some lessons that Obama could take from that.
Well, it's interesting, they've narrowed the window to a year to 18 months apparently now, and the time that you have has been sort of truncated. But it's interesting, I mean, if Obama chooses, as he has done already, didn't really have a choice to run with gun control, it'll be a really difficult political battle. He may not win. Certainly, there's huge resistance in Congress from NRA supporters and so on to putting through a lot of these restrictions on assault weapons and so on. But the public are behind him, a lot of the public anyway, and the media are behind him, which must help a lot in terms of how much scope you have to achieve change, or how people perceive the defeat and who they blame for it. It's the same with the fiscal cliff. I mean, it's in the short term, it is the Republicans who are the target of people's opprobrium because they're seen as the ones who are blocking quite sensible policy of you've got to pass this budget, you haven't got a choice, but here they are blocking it. In the long term, it might reflect more on the president if people suddenly have to start paying more taxes.
Rob, do you see any lessons to be learned from the Clinton?
Well, I think, I mean, the two presidents are beginning their second terms in, again, very, very different times. You know, Clinton was the go-go 90s. Everything was looking great. Right now, we're still feeling very unsettled about, what the short-term economic future of America looks like. There's a lot still to be done on that. In terms of the legacy point, though, it may well be that we've already gone over, or we haven't really discussed it at length, and I think we probably should, is the legacy issue that I see that's already come up is the healthcare adoption. Yeah, there's a lot left to do. I mean, the way that the legislation was passed, it wasn't sort of the big bang approach that was taken here in Britain, where on one day there was no national health and the next day everyone was being treated. The U.S. system is going to take longer to go in, and we're in the implementation phase now. So over the course of the next few years, I think one of Obama's greatest challenges mostly will be concentrated in the executive branch, which is the process of implementing this legislation that was upheld by the Supreme Court, and now we've got this long sort of executive cycle. My fear for that legacy would have been if we had not won re-election, then because so much of that's happening in the executive branch, it could have been delayed or subverted or other problems happening. So I think that's the signature issue that's going to be remembered.
And a lot of it will continue even after 2016 in terms of
Exactly.
implementation.
These two gentlemen, in whichever order you guys sort it out. Go ahead, you, sir.
I wonder whether the panel would agree with the view that as we move towards the next presidential election and the focus, from the Republican point of view turns to who they should nominate, I would think that tend to be more moderate candidates on the basis that, they need to be more inclusive and so on. And, well,
You'd think
you may
so,
disagree.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? That presupposes that there's someone actually running the Republican Party who's actually interested in reaching out and getting a majority of Americans to like them and form a coalition around their party. That's not actually what they're doing. They're shrinking and collapsing into themselves.
That was my question, whether that'll kind of force the party to move in a less confrontational direction with those sorts of people coming to the fore.
Can I, before you just, destroy the Republican
I'm
Party?
going to pounce on this, right?
Can I just make one small point about, yes, the Republican Party is having real issues right now, and there's a lot of people who aren't saying the right things. But you have Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, Hispanic, who this week said that we're going to make a step toward granting citizenship for illegal immigrants who are here. And guess what? Paul Ryan said, I agree. So, yes, you have some people who aren't going to go that route, but I think there will be some who do. And I think it's too early to predict, but, whether those people end up as the main candidates in whatever it is, 2 years and 9 months, when the primaries start again, is when we'll see whether the Republican Party has decided to try and tap into that 71% of Hispanics who voted for Obama and is the highest.
I think it's going to take a bit more than that, though. And I think what the Republicans, what I haven't seen any evidence of yet, is they haven't yet had their Barry Goldwater moment. 1964, they nominated Barry Goldwater, who was extraordinarily right-wing by the measure of that day. And you could see from the old tapes of the Republican convention that year that their convention delegates were kind of unsettled by what was going on. They lost decisively, and then there was a huge amount of ruction within the Republican Party that caused them to reinvent themselves. See, here's the thing. I don't know if there's yet the political will within the Republican Party to recognize that they're losing decisively. I think they could easily still be grabbing on by their fingernails and saying, no, if only we'd have nominated Santorum, he would have got the job done. We needed someone even more like the real Republicans. I think there's a very real possibility that they'll shoot even further to the right in the next election, and then they'll lose.
I mean, this is the problem, isn't it, with the primary process, is that during a primary, you're running to you're campaigning to your base, and they're not the same people as the public who are going to elect somebody in a general election.
Yeah, but again, it's.
Of course, both parties will be picking
why is
candidates.
Ian Duncan Smith transferring to Michael Howard floating through my brain as I think about this? Because I think that may be where the Republican Party is in an analogous place at the moment, but because of the fundamental difference in the way the government is structured.
Right.
So long as they hold on to the House of Representatives, they can screw any Democratic president they want. Right. Now, I just want to move on to the fellow in the red sweater. Yes, go ahead.
Just in terms of both assessing the last 4 years and moving forward, and I say this despite the accent as a voter and an Obama voter on 2 occasions, and I think you brought up about the question of legacy as indicated by appointments. I mean, I think some people were disappointed because, when his first appointment in the economy, which was in 2008, the key issue, Tiffany Geithner and Larry Sumner, who it doesn't take an economics genius to understand where they stand and what they represent. You can't take it all about to it's Republicans this who do seem from this coast, and even when you live there, insane by British standards. He made those decisions, and that was a peak of Obama's choice, whatever, he could do anything he wanted in that, and everyone was arguing him in that issue. And he chose those 2 people who, are so, whatever their literal involvement, are so clearly coloured by an involvement in an issue. That speaks not to a desire to be collaborative, that speaks to a desire to there being a gap between how he run and, I was there in America at the inauguration in Harlem on the night, it was amazing and wonderful. But then he got a chance to prove what he was actually going to do and not just talk about, and it didn't seem to qualify. And obviously, you're never going to vote for the Republican Party if you're like, us, me and you, Rob, you're not going to vote for Romney. That's the choice. But that doesn't mean the gap is not significant between what he said and what he did. So we'll see whether in the next 4 years that gap gets any smaller. But
so let's put this in the theme of the evening, which is the challenge for Obama. Is one of the challenges to finally live up to what his base read into him. Right. From 2004, I just happened to be in Boston the night he made that speech. And I remember, I don't know how many of you saw the speech he gave to the Democratic Convention in 2004. I mean, not even Mario Cuomo, and I'm going back quite a long way, who gave a brilliant speech in 1984 and became the prince over the water for 20 years. He gave this speech in 2004. He said, this is the man. He is the chosen one. And I think to some people in the Democratic base, it's been one disappointment after another ever since. Now, in terms of legacy and challenge, is one of his challenges to finally live up to the inspiring nature of his rhetoric?
But what if that the notions that a lot of people had about Barack Obama in 2008 weren't really right? I mean, the challenge isn't he has to live up to what everyone expected of him. Here's a guy who voted present in the Illinois state legislature like 50% of the time, or some ridiculous number because he didn't want to take a side. He has never been quite the guy that everyone assumed he was, except rhetorically, when it came to Iraq, when it came to 2004. And you asked about, if we were to do about foreign policy, you ask anybody in Pakistan or Afghanistan where I've been, Obama's worse than, well, maybe not Afghanistan, Pakistan, certainly Obama's worse than Bush. He took Bush's policies and he just supersized them. So, I think we have to be very careful at saying, has Obama disappointed us because of our expectations, or has he somehow said one thing and done another? And I think a lot of us, across the world, had huge expectations that he was this Messiah who was going to come in and make peace everywhere. And he hasn't, and he isn't.
But if you look at the speech he gave at the inauguration, 4 years ago, it was all about trying to damp down expectations, saying, don't expect me to solve the world's problems because that's not going to happen. It's going to be tough. There's going to be difficult times ahead. He had this burden of expectation which he didn't necessarily want, but you can't afford to deny it during an election campaign when you need people to be enthusiastic about you. But I guess all along he knew that, given the constraints of the economic crisis, especially, that there's not that much room for.
Then we got to keep focused on a couple of realities here. Reality number one is that once somebody is elected president of the United States, their job is to act for the benefit of and in the interests of all of the people of the United States, including the people who didn't vote for him. I mean, there are people like me who saw that speech in 2004 and thought, who is this guy and why isn't he running? I mean, it was an incident, it was an electrifying moment, and who campaigned for him ever since. But a lot of people he's representing now are sort of like nowhere near that. The second thing that we all need to remember is something a friend of mine mentioned when I went back to Chicago just after the election in 2008, who said, well, he's won. I said, yeah, he has. And he says, I guess from now on, the only people he'll disappoint are the ones who supported him. Because, I doubt he's really disappointed the Republicans, because all this time they've been saying, oh, he's going to be absolutely awful. I guess the best thing they could say is he hasn't plunged the United States into a communist theocracy or something like that, because that seemed to be what they were trying to sell. But let's also remember, we're talking here about somebody who has had some tremendous accomplishments. The healthcare reform in the United States was something that, presidents for the last 50 years, 60, 70 years have been trying to accomplish and failed. It was an enormous task. It is a huge accomplishment. We don't yet have the benefit of the distance of time to know just how big a deal that is, because it's being phased in over time and all that kind of stuff. We have a president who was instrumental in helping to save the United States economy from a second Great Depression. Those two alone are sort of like worth the price of admission.
There's totally, it's not, I wasn't making a very simplistic blanket, but there are some things where that gap is because of, as you said, so expectation, and that's naivety, and that's good to be, made realistic, especially if you're, just relatively new to it.
Well,
there are also some things like, in drone, as an obvious example, where there is a gap between what he presented himself and nonsense expectation and what he's actually done. But it isn't like, we're fantasizing. He's actually done stuff that seems to, as you said, Bush plus, and there's no reason for him to have to, not compelled to do it because of the Republicans.
I'm going to stop you there because we're going to shift in just 1 second onto the foreign policy side of things. But there's one question at the back.
Yeah, we talked earlier about sort of solving the logjam at the heart of American politics and so on, and what Bush and what Obama needs to do in his second term. Surely one of his priorities has to be to win back the House, and I wonder what you think his strategy or the Democratic Party's strategy needs to be to do that.
Okay, I'm going to. This is a good question for Rob, because it's not just the president isn't the full-time chairman of the Democratic National Committee.
I appreciate that.
He is just the figurehead. But is there a way of using that figure?
Well, it's a funny thing. In this election just gone, a majority of the voters of the United States of America said that they wanted their congressman to be a Democrat, not a Republican. And yet we do not have a majority of the House of Representatives who are themselves a Republican. And the reason for that, as has already been alluded to many times, is because of the process of redistricting and the process of gerrymandering. My home district, in fact, is next door to John Boehner's district, and my district is just redrawn to some weird pencil-thin shape that I don't even recognize in order to create a safe seat for a guy who I really don't know what he does other than get reelected as a Republican. The midterm election coming up in 2014, I didn't know I'd be talking about campaigning so soon, but the fact of the matter is, history teaches us that what happens at midterm elections is that the party in power has, in the White House, has a pretty heavy difficulty increasing its numbers in the House of Representatives. So we're all going to get out there and campaign like the devil to make whatever gains we can. But I'm telling you now, it's a hard slog to say taking back the House. The opportunity for that, I think, is going to be much more ripe in 2016. And what's going to help us with that is if John Boehner and the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives continue down this stated, very clear, easy to understand negotiating strategy. John Boehner summed it up when he said, "We're not the party of no, we are the party of hell no." I mean, he's told us what their negotiating strategy is. We're going to sit here and sit on our hands and let everything fail and make everything get worse in hopes that he won't get reelected. That didn't work, we got reelected. If they keep that negotiating strategy up, 2016 is probably our best opportunity to retake both houses of Congress.
I'm going to move this on a little bit. It's in my capacity as chairman of this discussion, and go back to the beginning. When Nick opened things out and he was talking about an Obama doctrine, legacy, and this kind of picks up on the point you were getting to a moment ago, and about drones and so on. And let's talk a bit about how Obama is going to extricate on time the United States from Afghanistan. You would know, Nick.
I think the two wars that the U.S. have been fighting, definition of victory is no longer, are we going to win, is when can we leave? The U.S. doesn't, well, I shouldn't say this so dramatically. The people who are making the decisions about Afghanistan are leaving. They have decided to leave. They have decided to leave, many people believe, irrespective of what is happening in Afghanistan. Now, we can debate for hours whether an Afghanistan with 12,000 American troops or 2,000 American troops or 110,000 American troops is safer in the long run. But the U.S. is leaving. Britain's leaving. The world is leaving. 90% of the economy that's in Afghanistan will disappear in the next, whatever it is, 21 months. And so the real question is, how does the international community, how does the U.S. help Afghanistan transition, right? And that is perhaps part of Obama's legacy, but that's in the weeds. I mean, when it comes to what we've been talking about so far in terms of politics, the U.S. electorate has moved on. Talk about Syria, we could talk about Mali, talk about American hostages in Algeria, but Afghanistan is, come on. And so what will be the challenge is for him to make sure that, and not only him, the military, the State Department, the entire structure, USAID, to make sure that they are beginning to spend money in the right way in Afghanistan to the right people on the right projects, because 90% of the money that was in the military will go. And so now you have just a few $100 million or maybe $1 billion or $2 billion to spend where you need to, on education, on lots of things, and we don't have to go into that forever. And that's where the U.S. needs to focus on. That's what President Obama's legacy will be in Afghanistan.
It's interesting when you look at the new appointments at State and Defence. If you look at Chuck Hagel's positions and John Kerry, they're both people who are very much against a policy of sort of aggressive interventionism in the rest of the world. It seems likely, if these are the people, and with John Brennan at CIA, that these are the kind of people who will continue with a very disengaged policy, who only want America to get involved in international conflicts if, as a very, very last resort, if American interests are directly affected. Otherwise, no, they don't want to go there. There's no great appetite for involvement in Syria. There's no great appetite for any kind of clash with Iran. And I think that, maybe not an isolationist America, but one which doesn't see its role as being quite so much the world's policeman as it was before.
Do you think that the so I'm going to have a special question for you, Rob, in a second. But do you think that the tilt towards Asia, which is very real and underreported because it doesn't involve a lot of people getting shot at, but it's a very real commitment of time and money, reorientation. Is that going to be part of a legacy? Do you think, is that a challenge over these next 4 years? Felicity?
Well, no, it would be. I mean, this is what Obama has been trying to achieve, I suppose, is this to look towards the Asia Pacific region as the main focus for engagement, rather than a foreign policy which is all about hostilities, one which is about building a sort of sensible alliance with the countries which are going to be more powerful in the world, and to work out how economic relationships will work when America isn't the world's leading economy anymore.
I just want to also pick up, because I know that many people in the House will be curious to know about, you're here as his chief defender now, about Guantanamo and drones. They seem to come together in the mind. There was the promise of closing down Gitmo. Didn't happen. And then suddenly there's been this mushrooming use of unmanned systems to assassinate people. One, have you been surprised personally about this, Robin? Do you understand the reasons why Guantanamo is still open?
I think the short answer to that is it's still open because it hasn't yet been possible to close it in the way that we would all like. But before I say anything else on this, I need to make something absolutely crystal clear so there's no confusion in the room. Please, everyone, remember that my job here today is to try to expound on the political side as a political organizer and a political campaigner, the political aspects of what the administration is trying to do.
Okay, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, I just want to make it clear that I'm not here representing the White House.
Well then,
or the State Department,
as a political organizer, have you found over this electoral cycle, for example, that people who would normally be really gung-ho Democrats and out there campaigning have expressed reservations about this aspect of his presidency?
Not very much, no.
Really?
It has not been a significant, it was not a significant factor in the campaign. It was not a significant factor in the election. It was not on anybody's top 3 or top 5 list of reasons I'm going to vote for this guy as opposed to that guy. It's within the domestic context of the United States political system, it was a non-issue in this election. I'm not saying it's unimportant. It's obviously important. It's critically important. But it was not a political driver in this election. The political drivers in this election just gone. Primarily the economy. Economy, jobs, government debt, government spending. Those issues resonated everywhere, and who's the better person to lead us forward? That's what this election was fought over.
And it was probably neutralised by the fact that they killed Osama bin Laden. I mean, you can't really attack from the right on those issues.
But even Obama, you know, when asked, okay, talk about Al-Qaeda, talk about counterterrorism. Well, you know, I ended 2 wars and I killed Osama, but I really want to talk about his jobs. I mean, everybody wanted to talk about jobs. You know, you go through the top 10 list in the exit polls of what people voted on. I mean, terrorism, Afghanistan, Iraq, you know, all of these things were, you know, well below 6, 7, 8. Some of them were like 20. I mean, you know, it just wasn't the reason that people voted for him at all.
I mean, how many of the folks in the audience are surprised to hear about that? My guess is that many people in the audience are actually quite concerned about the way drones are being used and the continued use of Guantanamo as a detainee center. Are you at all surprised to hear that it's actually not that important?
I didn't say it wasn't that important.
No, I'm saying
Let's be clear.
For voters.
For voters. That's what I meant. So no one's surprised. Okay. Then let's carry on with this conversation about I don't know. It seems to me there's still plenty of sand traps out there.
Well, Syria. I mean, you know, there's a new State Department cable from the Free Syrian Army, the Syrian rebels, whatever you want to call them, that's floating around Washington in the last week or so that suggests that unless we figure out a way out, unless there is a concrete effort to find a political opposition, to organize them, and to figure something out, northern Syria is a failed state. Absolutely failed state. And what happens in that failed state, and we've seen this in Afghanistan as well, is that you get a lot of actors. It's not easy to distinguish who's who. You get a lot of corruption among those actors. You get a lot of warlords. You have a lot of rape. There's been a lot of rape lately in the news. There's been a lot of horrible things happening. And the Al-Qaeda branch, or the closest thing that you have to Al-Qaeda branch, comes into northern Syria and says, you know what, we don't do this. We don't do that. We don't do corruption. We're not warlords. As a matter of fact, here's the guy who's been stealing from, I think one of the best examples was like electricity bill. Someone was just siphoning off the electricity bill. Some of the militants came in, said, here's your guy. We're going to give him justice. And maybe people don't like the way that justice is meted out, but at the end of the day, with that vacuum, You have people who are meting out justice, who are slowly becoming more popular. And it's a huge problem. And it doesn't seem like the Obama administration has a real strategy for Syria right now. And I think that's one of the biggest sand traps.
And you're seeing the consequences as well of the collapse of the regime in Libya, in Mali at the moment. I mean, a lot of the rebels were people who had been fighting with Gaddafi, and a lot of the weapons have been flooding across from there. So, I mean, all these sort of domino effects, if you like, of the collapse of some of these totalitarian regimes, whether or not the new look foreign team that Obama has around him have any better handle on it. I mean, he did promise when he first took office, and another one of those, the speech, was it in Germany, where he promised to reach out to form new alliances with different groups, and I don't know whether there's much evidence that that's happened at all.
Well, since you just mentioned dominoes, you seem to have put the domino theory in play, for those of us who remember what that is. I think we can draw already a historical distinction between two, in their own way, great Democratic presidents, Lyndon Johnson on the one hand and Barack Obama on the other. Both of them inherited what either were or became deeply unpopular conflicts. The difference, though, is that President Johnson got caught up in the trap of continually doubling down on engagement in Vietnam, and as a result, a big part of his legacy is sadly being remembered as the president who ramped up the disastrous involvement in Vietnam, even though he should be remembered for so many other things, like the Civil Rights Act and like attempting to increase welfare and social stability in the United States. President Obama, on the other hand, inherited the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time, but we're seeing a slow and sure withdrawal from the Iraq conflict, as well as a slow but sure and steady withdrawal from the Afghanistan conflict. As a result, and since you guys mentioned legacy a lot, I don't think that the engagement with or withdrawal from those two particular conflicts are going to form a significant part of his legacy.
But we don't know how Iraq and Afghanistan are going to come out. And I would argue that, to a certain extent, Obama may not be remembered for what happens in Afghanistan, and I don't think anyone thinks it's going to go well. He may not be remembered for that, in part because of what we talked about in terms of what the American people want to listen to and want to watch. I mean, I can blame myself in part for this. The media in Afghanistan that's been there for the last 4 or 5 years, has covered it a certain way. The editors want a relatively positive story. The narrative is, we're leaving. It's getting better. The Afghan army can shoot. The Afghan police are okay. Some of it's absolute rubbish. But to a certain extent, no one cares. The media isn't doing a good enough job at it. And it's still in the balance in Afghanistan. And so, yes, you're right. Johnson's legacy is hampered by Vietnam, whereas it could have been so many other things. Obama may get away with how he's withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan, but not because there's some utopia that he's created and it's all working out well.
I never meant to suggest that it would be.
I just wonder if there's any solution to some of these situations, and that part of the way if we talk about legacy, or the challenge in trying to get some control, is that for all that the world, citizens of the world, as individuals and in collective societies, impart to the American president godlike power. Not that he's godlike, but that he has this extraordinary power that can do anything they want. I remember everywhere I went in Iraq, when I was there during the war, when anything was going wrong, it was the understanding that, well, George Bush could just do this tomorrow. You could call, I should, sometimes, in the street. You've had these conversations, I'm sure, Nick. You can call the White House and tell him what to do, and he can do it. He has this power. He doesn't. He doesn't have the power to bring forth some sense of pragmatism in the opposition that he faces on his domestic issues. And I'm just wondering if part of the way that Obama will be remembered is as a man who had to deal with these extreme limitations and either did well or badly, depending on your view. The presidency doesn't convey the kind of power that the world imputes to it, does it?
Sure, but if you talk to people on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, they say, you guys can read my license plate, why can't you fix everything else? And you have to explain to them, no, the CIA actually encourages that thought. So it's not like Obama is tamping that down. But, I think to go back to the very first part of the question, if there is a solution, if we had an advisor on the National Security Council here right now and asking them, what's a kind of solution where you could draw a line? And if I were to draw a line from Cairo to Aleppo to Baghdad to Kabul, one of the things that I think this new team will really try and do is what didn't happen in Iraq. So the war is prosecuted, the initial phase, whatever we want to call it, ends, the army dissolves. That's the one thing, perhaps the single most big lesson that this team, I think, will say we learned. And so in Egypt, we had a revolution, the state services, the army, these things stayed together. In Syria, we're desperately afraid of what happened in Iraq, so therefore, we're not making decisions that will possibly, it's so hard to tell, we're not making decisions that may lead to the dissolution of the Syrian army, because if that happens, we're in even worse shape than we are. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, what we haven't seen is that policy of trying to lift up the state institutions rather than fighting it via drone or by 19-year-old Texans. So yes, Obama doesn't have that power that the CIA claims or pretends he does, but he does have the ability to kind of draw a large map and say, how do we try and move on these revolutions? And so far, he hasn't done that except in Syria, and to a certain extent he got lucky in Egypt.
I don't want to get sidetracked here, but each country is discrete. And the difference between a Ba'athist totalitarian state and Egypt is huge, significant. But I just want to come to Felicity on this question about, as an outsider who spends more than enough time covering Washington from the inside, how do you characterize the power of the presidency?
Well, coming from a British perspective, I remember when I first went to America, and I imagined that it was like the British system where once you were elected, you had this mandate and then you carried it out. I didn't quite understand the whole checks and balances within the system and the way that the executive branch was more or less fighting with the legislative branch rather than working with them, if in the situation of divided government. Even when it's their own party, there isn't the same whip system as there is in this country, where people from the same parties will more or less automatically vote for their own party's bills. That doesn't even happen. So I was quite surprised by the limited scope, if you like, of presidential power. I mean, it is all about, in a way, the bully pulpit. Your major power is this huge megaphone that you have to amplify your message, to speak to the American people. You have the sort of trappings of your office. That's by and large the disappointment, I suppose, that people felt in Obama was that he wasn't using that enough, and they all thought he would because he was such a great orator. They thought, oh my God, this is the guy who's going to inspire everybody with his promises, who's going to lead everybody to where his vision is, and because that wasn't articulated very clearly or wasn't amplified enough, I don't know which was the problem, that's where I think his power became very limited.
Yes.
So as the token Republican in the room, and possibly, well, most assuredly the token Mormon in the room, I come tonight in deep mourning. And the mourning has continued because I've heard my party characterized in a way that I don't recognize nor identify with, because I was a Republican who attended the inauguration and was so proud of my country that we elected President Obama, even though I did not vote for him and have been disappointed. But that aside, I supported Romney, not only because he's a hotel relative, but because I believed he could fix the economy. And as I wanted to illuminate a question that Nick has touched on, and maybe in a Nickism way of the bigger picture, bigger questions. A friend of mine at the BBC, who's a very good friend of Frontline, I was talking with the other day, and she said that the issue for her came down, between Romney and Obama, came down to foreign policy. And she, even though she did believe that Romney would fix America, specifically would fix the economy, that she had to vote for Obama because he had better credentials internationally. And with Nick's comment about Obama being a bigger Bush in some aspects, I wanted to hear what the panel had to say about this. Do you believe that Obama, of course, we've never seen Romney operate in an international context except as a more missionary in France. Who would have been better? Who will be? Obama now, we will see his record. We have seen his record. Who would have been better between the two?
But we just work our way from right to left.
Well, I feel you've. First of all, I'm glad you're here. I wish we had more than a token Republican. It would be nice to have a whole group of you. Having said that, I feel like
Binders full of them, huh?
you've binders full.
Almost my Halloween costume.
But I feel like you've drawn me onto familiar territory. I hate to kick a guy when he's down. I mean, Governor Romney ran a really tough campaign. But the fact of the matter is, I never saw any evidence of him having the kind of characteristics or skills that would make him an effective international diplomat or international leader. If anything, we had a terrible, awful counterexample of that when he visited London before the election, the famous Romney shambles debacle, where he comes to one of our country's most important allies, lands in the middle of one of the most up with people, hooray, happy kind of events every 4 years, the Olympics, and gives his first press conferences and manages to piss off half the country. That's because the other half hadn't listened to it yet. I think that was actually symptomatic of something that would have made it very difficult for him to govern, and did make it very difficult for him to govern in Massachusetts. And that is, for a politician, with the deepest of respect to him, he just has a tin ear for politics. He doesn't hear the sound of his own words when he speaks them. He goes.
He's not a politician.
Well, actually, I would disagree with the businessman side as well. But at least on. But my job here is to just disagree with him as a politician. Right. So I'll stick to that. I mean, he would just say things that he would just do a calculation of what he thought was the optimum path or the most efficient way of expressing an idea, and he never seemed to appreciate the impact that his words would have. I mean, I really do have to wonder, why did he want the job so much that he spent 7 years of his life and $50 million of his money and $500 million of other people's money trying to get it? I can't for the life of me figure out why he wanted the job, because I just didn't see any indication that he would be particularly good at it. And I'm so sorry, because I know you feel it passionately.
Just quickly, because we're running out of time. Do you have anything more to say about it?
It was just astonishing to me, the amount of gas he managed to come up with. For a man who's been involved in politics for that long, not to know that when you talk about your car elevator or the fact that you like firing people is going to go down quite badly is really astonishing. But it would be a bit unfair to say that because he had no experience in foreign affairs, therefore he wouldn't be any good at it, because obviously Obama had absolutely no experience in that. Nobody does, unless they've already been.
Except he did grow up in a lot of different countries and has a particularly useful background if you're not going to have a big CV. And a big CV doesn't necessarily help you in foreign policy anyway.
But if we're going to compare the two in terms of policies, in terms of what Romney said were his policies and what Obama has done and says he will done, not that different.
Okay. Now, here we go. We've got the hands up because we're coming to the end, and suddenly everybody's pointing skyward. You, sir.
Quick question, and to whoever. We just talked about Romney, and he was the chosen of the Republicans. And if you think about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the field, there were, 10 people, and the other 9 were obviously much worse. What would you say about the sort of nature of American politics? First of all, it starts 3 years before the election, so a year from now we start talking. And the second is that the field is so bad that the least bad is, ends up.
All right. In order to get all the questions in before the clock stops, I'm just going to throw that one straight to Felicity, who spends more time in America than we do.
It was, I mean, look, you had a range of people that reflected the political interests of the Republican Party at the time. I mean, the problem with I think this particular election was that some of the people who might have been better candidates didn't want to run because they had a kind of inkling that they were going to lose. So I think you might see people like Marco Rubio, who, for example, who probably would have been quite a dynamic candidate and certainly more more youthful, more sort of open to other political viewpoints and so on. He's going to be running in 2016. I think that's what hampered this particular primary round.
Okay, in the back, the lady in the blue sweater there. Yes.
America is becoming increasingly more isolated in its support for Israel as Israel behaves worse and worse. I was wondering if that's something that worries Obama, whether he's going to change.
Well, we have no evidence of the contrary yet. I mean, I think, you know, we get a lot of reporting, including probably a leak from the NSC last week about how Obama hates Netanyahu and there's this terrible relationship and he can't understand why there's more settlements and all sorts of things. But until we actually see some kind of difference in public policy, in public statements, and not just leaks to various journalists who they may like, there's no evidence that Obama has a plan of doing anything differently with Israel than he or, frankly, all of his predecessors. Now, I'm sure some people would disagree with that, but really, in terms of the actual policy, in terms of his, even in better rhetoric about Iran, there's not that much daylight there. And the Hamas, you know, I mean, never did he say Israel needs to show restraint, I think would have been the traditional phrase in terms of its bombing. You never heard that from state or from him.
But interesting, I mean, just in a practical, let me just ask you, if you were to rank, we were talking about Syria earlier, I mean, today as a knock-on, doubtless, I mean, I'm not there, but I'd wager it as a theory of the crime. You've had an Al-Qaeda action in Algeria near the Libya-Mali border. I mean, if you had to rank all the crises in the Middle East right now, where would you put Israel-Palestine if you have a certain number of hours in the day in which to devote to these? At this moment in time, Israel-Palestine's been the same. Why don't you just do that?
That was the crux of my question, though, really, because America's becoming more and more isolated in its unequivocal support for Israel.
But what I'm saying is, if it was possible to focus on Israel-Palestine, given what's happening across the region today, if you have a certain fixed number of hours in any day, some of which can be devoted to foreign policy, where would you rank the crisis in Israel-Palestine? It seems to me that it's at a point of stasis, and my guess is that the Obama administration feels the same way. It's just static at the moment.
But that's true, but there's a but there, that even if you rank Israel-Palestine number 4, number 6, whatever it is, there is always the fact that if you work on that, and if you make progress on that, it has a huge impact in every country that's above it on the list, as well as all the way to South Asia. Now, that's, you know, you can dispute that, but there is an argument that can be made that if you focus on that, actually it'll help other countries and other policies.
Felicity or Rob, do you have anything you want to add to that before I go to the next question?
I'll only repeat something that I've heard said already, and that is, as between the Democratic and the Republican candidates in this last election, viewed from a global perspective, there was very little difference between them in terms of their treatment of Israel. And the fact of the matter is, what we have to bear in mind is that it is a fundamental principle of U.S. politics. It is a fundamental principle of the U.S. diplomatic process that the security of the state of Israel is a critical factor that must be fostered and must be protected.
Yeah, and I don't think anything about having Chuck Hagel in defence, who's purported to be less pro-Israel than some. I don't think it will make any difference.
But he could make some statements that go a little farther than he has in the past or his predecessors. There's no evidence that he will.
Okay, we've got just next to that.
Yeah,
yes,
sorry, just linked to that. Obviously, Iran, the situation there, the nuclear efforts are going to carry on being an issue. The US is not going to be able to bury its head in the sand. So if you could say something about that, and then that will affect Israel as well. Also, the choice of the next Secretary of State, whoever gets chosen, what does that mean about how Obama wants to, perceive foreign policy in the next 4 years?
Well, I think you can link John Kerry, who's the next Secretary of State, Chuck Hagel, together in the sense that, and as Felicity was saying before, these are not men who are interventionists in terms of the traditional way. Now, drones is another issue entirely, and I'm sure there'll be lots more drones and more talk of drones the next 4 years in various countries. But I don't get the sense that Kerry or Hagel or Obama have any plan other than to continue what they've been doing with Iran, trying to have discussions, whether the rhetoric goes up or down, ultimately, I don't think there's a lot of interest in any kind of military intervention from any of those three men or from the administration right now. And I think that in general, that notion of talking a little more while at the same time having your planes hover above is kind of is the way they're going to look.
Kerry is a classic diplomatist as well. I mean, he is somebody who spent years now as a special envoy, but also in Senate Foreign Relations. He knows all these world leaders. He's been out there sort of negotiating, walking Karzai back, if you like, from the
even with Assad. He's met Assad for
if there were but world enough in time, we could talk about whether Secretary of State Kerry would have led the interventionists in Libya. It might have been a different conversation. Yes.
Hi, my question is about China, so moving away from the Middle East. And during the TV debates, we heard a lot of tough talk from both sides. But in reality, the policy seems to be more about compromise than conflict. And America has had the opportunity to assert itself in China. And I was just wondering what the strategy was there, or what you predict it is.
Well, actually, a terrible thought just popped into my head as you said that, which is, at the moment, it seems a little bit easier to negotiate with China than it does to negotiate with the Republican Party.
On intellectual property things?
Oh, you got it in. Eventually, marvelous intellectual property. No, we were saying before we started that's not going to be one of the top 10 issues for this administration is intellectual property. And there have been gains there as well, including with China. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. engagement with China has been going on for decades now. I don't see us making sort of a pivot turn in the relationship with China anytime soon. There need to be some negotiated changes in the relationship, and those will take a certain pace. Everything negotiated with China for the last millennia has happened slowly. I mean, that's one thing China does really well, is patience and wait and take things one step at a time. If you don't go work at that pace, you don't get anywhere.
So just as when people look back at Nixon's presidency, the one thing everyone agrees on was, the opening to China. This is an important part of his legacy. You're saying that perhaps we're just in a process point at this moment, and there won't be a dramatic.
I would be really surprised if we saw sort of a dramatic shift of that nature, because the relationship at the moment is stable and it's producing benefits and challenges for both countries.
One last question, yes.
And my question is around Latin America, and seeing how the U.S. will act on things that are happening, for instance, in countries like Venezuela, where we don't know if there's a constitutional breach, or even if Chavez is dead already, and etc.
I'm not a Latin American specialist. She says quickly.
You spend more time on that side of the Atlantic than we do, even if it's not below the equator. So when is there much talk about Latin America in Washington when you're there, Felicity?
Only in the sense that of issues like immigration, I think. I don't want to kind of stereotype the whole issue, but I mean, one of the other main plan that we didn't touch on at all was immigration, that Obama has said he wants to achieve in his second term, and part of that is all about, I guess, not just shoring up the borders and ensuring the citizenship for these 11 million people, but also establishing a relationship with Latin American countries, which means that the instability which forces so many people across the border isn't such a grave concern. But I mean, I'm not a Latin America specialist, so I can't say what plans they have for a post-Chavez Venezuela or anything like that.
I think one of the interesting things, I would say, perhaps, what country are you from?
Venezuela.
You're from Venezuela.
We should ask you then.
Essentially, is that 30 years ago when Ronald Reagan took office, Latin America was a big deal. Central America, what was going to happen in the Caribbean basin, and you still had these quite hideous military dictatorships in other parts of South America. Today, not so much. Doesn't really impinge on American consciousness, except on the immigration issue, which is very much related to the economics of primarily Mexico and Central America. But South America seems to have crossed over. Do you find that?
Well, it definitely feels that the U.S. is not as present as it was. that's why I guess that Chavez found that space to become a leader in the region and start moving into a more communist type of state and seen as the U.S. as a big foreign enemy. But there's still a view of the U.S. trying to ensure that democracy is respected in every country. And when things such as the one that is happening in Venezuela occur, the strong action is many times expected, at least in terms of the speech, the messages that they want to deliver, which hasn't really been clear at the moment.
We've run out of time, but before we end, I started by asking people to go this way and talk about, and I want to come back this way now that we've been talking about it for an hour and a half. And I just wonder if you could think to, say, 2030, people are going to look back. How will they look back at Barack Obama in a short, pithy style? Because we're journalists, you know, we're good with words.
Well, I think the panel's right. I mean, I think that people will look back on healthcare and assuming it goes through and is allowed, maybe gun control, you know. But I don't get the sense that, and Bin Laden, perhaps. But, you know, the fact is that there's no evidence that we have today that people will look back on Barack Obama as a foreign policy president. They'll look back on what he's done with healthcare, what he's done with gun control, perhaps, whatever he can get through. And that's what they'll look at.
Felicity?
I think one thing he's got to avoid is what's known as the second-term curse, isn't he? I mean, apparently it's some trap which presidents tend to fall into, that in the second term something goes badly wrong. So if that doesn't happen, then he will be remembered as the president who took the troops out of Iraq, who took the troops out of Afghanistan, who brought in healthcare. Unless something happens like with Clinton well, hopefully that won't happen for them. Some unknown event or something like that to overshadow everything else. But I think he probably will be remembered kindly, not as a transformational president maybe who changed Washington as he tried to set out to do, but as somebody who did achieve changes which I think when people look back will seem a lot more significant than they do now.
Rob?
I agree that from the perspective of 2030, the single issue on the top of the list will probably be healthcare, will probably be the legacy issue. I don't think it'll be the withdrawal from Iraq, although if someone has to make a top 5 list, it might be in top 5. But I think healthcare will stand head and shoulders above it in the consciousness of the American public. I
want to thank my panel. They've been great. Rob Carolina, Felicity Spector, and Nick Schifrin. And I'm sure they'll hang around for some of the questions you didn't have time to ask from the floor. Thank you all for coming. It's been a really, really good talk. Thanks a lot.